Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. A few quick housekeeping notes. All audience members' phones and cameras are turned off and muted. We do encourage you to use the chat function in the Zoom at the bottom of your screen to let us know where you're joining from tonight. We'll also be taking questions from the audience throughout the discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A box also located at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. We're also recording tonight's conversation, and we'll make that recording available on our connected.du.edu website, as well as in a follow-up email to everyone who registered for tonight's event. Please feel free to share it with friends and family after you receive the link. My name is Erin Dietrich, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and I'm honored to introduce tonight's event and speakers. Tonight's conversation of the social justice movement through the liberal arts perspective is part of the Pathways to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. This event series aims to nurture continuous education, provide helpful resources, and create a welcome forum for honest conversations about how we can come together as a DU community to address current events and the social and racial justice movement. We as a university and as a college are committed to bringing relevant and timely programs that incite civil discourse in a way that leverages the critical analysis so deeply rooted in the academic areas of the liberal arts. We'd like to take a quick moment to read the University of Denver's land acknowledgement. It is important for us to take this time to acknowledge that the University of Denver resides in the homeland of Indigenous peoples. We must not forget the institution's history of John Evans, founder of DU, and his culpability in the Sand Creek, one of many atrocities to humanity. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. We also recognize the surviving communities who continue to live here today, from the Northern Cheyenne tribe of Montana, the Northern Arapaho tribe of Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and the Ute Mountain area. Now I'd like to introduce Danny McIntosh, Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and proud alumnus of the University of Denver. Danny is in his 7th year as Dean of the college and has led the college in providing students with integrative learning experiences, supporting new and innovative programming developed by our faculty and staff, and in cultivating an intentional and inclusive community. He has positioned the college at the forefront of innovation, efficiency, and inclusive excellence. Danny, thank you for joining us here tonight and leading this very important discussion.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate it. It's great to be here tonight, and welcome to all of you in the audience. This series is part of DU's mission to be a private university dedicated to the public good. In the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, we believe that knowledge and understanding are critical to effective action, and that action is important. It is an important component of the public good and of understanding. In the United States, we're experiencing a powerful confluence of situations that have raised the salience and the stakes of social justice. COVID has affected all of our mental and physical health and economic situations, but there's been significantly greater impact on Native American, Black, and Latinx populations and other minoritized groups. The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and the social and the political responses to those have raised again the issues of systemic racism and how to address it. We also have the first Black woman on a major presidential ticket. We have the effective renaming and elimination of Confederate commemorations across the country. And we have visibly increased white engagement in addressing issues of racial justice. All these may be unique in some ways and uncomfortably familiar in others. They're important and powerful enough that we want to understand and consider what that understanding has to tell us about how to take action. Today we have 3 members of the DU community with expertise in this area. We've brought them together to share together their insights. Our panelists include Gregory Moore, who's editor-in-chief of Deek Digital, a Wheat Ridge-based agency that works with CEOs to create expert commentary that drives brand recognition and new businesses for companies. He was the editor of the Denver Post from 2002 to 2016. During that time, the Denver Post won 4 consecutive Pulitzer Prizes. He has now, more recently, become a commentator on issues of racial equity, diversity and inclusion, including Black Lives Matter and policing. He is a trustee of the University of Denver. Assistant Professor Angela Parker teaches 20th century US and Native American history. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan and her undergraduate degree from Stanford. Her research interests include indigenous oil politics and the genealogy of tribal sovereignty in the 20th century. Teaching Assistant Professor Roger Holland teaches music and religion and is also the director of the Spirituals Project at DU's Lamont School of Music. He received his Master's of Divinity degree from the Union Theological Seminary. He served as artist in residence and director of the Union Gospel Choir and was awarded Union's Trailblazers Distinguished Alumni Award in 2015 for his contribution to the legacy of African American music. Thank you all panelists for being here to share your experiences and expertise. Please unmute and become visible, and I will begin asking questions. For the audience, I wanted to let you know that I will ask some questions, and then I will share with our panelists questions that come from the question and answer system in Zoom. So, my first question is to say, how do you think this situation is different or not different than similar situations in the past and similar responses in the past? And are those similarities and differences for the good or for the worse? Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing your conversation.
I'll jump in. One of the things that I have found very interesting about the time, the place in which we find ourselves, because we've seen, certainly within the Black community, we have seen people, members of the Black community, gunned down and victims of police violence before. This is nothing new. This really traces all the way back to the origins of this country. After emancipation, we saw this kind of attack on Black bodies, Black liberties through the Black codes and Jim Crow era, all the way through what I call the formal civil rights movement, that for all intents and purposes, one could trace back to the Brown v. Board of Ed decision in 1954, and then the Montgomery boycotts, bus boycotts in 1955, the murders of I'm about to say Trayvon Martin, the murders of Emmett Till, and then, you know, so all of that just kind of contributed. And we see the formal civil rights movement through the 60s, led by Martin Luther King, and then through the Black Power movement of the 70s, and then the continuous ways in which Black bodies have been marginalized, disenfranchised, murdered as a result of police brutality or other means. But what I think is different right now is how this has coincided with the pandemic of the coronavirus, because most of us have been quarantined. We've been having to obey these stay-at-home orders where there was really nothing to do except for work at home and watch TV. And then in the month of May, we saw this plethora, a preponderance of Black people being murdered again through police brutality, particularly in the month of May. It started with Ahmaud Arbery, and then we had Breonna Taylor. In New York, we had Chris Cooper, who had the police department weaponized against him. And what was really interesting for me is the same day is when George Floyd was murdered, but we didn't find out till the next day. And so it was one thing after the other. We didn't get a chance to really breathe. And then the next thing you know, we're being bombarded with another situation. And I think because we were all quarantined And we had no choice but to see what was going on. And when we saw George Floyd with that police officer with his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the entire country and eventually the world bore witness to this atrocity, and people were outraged. And what was also interesting, not only did the entire world see this, but then eventually it was like the entire world responded. It started in one place, and then across the country, even here in Denver, we saw protests moving, but then it moved into other places. We saw protests going on in Tokyo. We saw a protest going on in Great Britain. We saw protests in places in Africa and Australia. And so this outrage and cry for social justice was not just an American thing, it became a global thing. And the people that are out there protesting, even in the United States, are not just African Americans, but are people from every walk of life, from various ethnicities. And so it's like the whole world has taken notice and has commented and has mobilized to say, this is not just, and we need for some change to happen.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I think that it's been for the good, you know, whether you asked whether or not this is, you know, for the good or is it negative. It's a super positive event. And one of the things that I think defines it is as Roger was saying earlier, it's the multi-generational, multicultural, you know, aspect of the movement. I mean, it may have started, you know, because of what happened in Ferguson and Michael Brown and all the other, you know, police shootings and things of that nature. They just piled on top of it until until we got to Minneapolis, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think what I think really you know, really moved people is that you know, 8 minutes and 46 seconds is really a long time. It's a really long time. You wouldn't do that to an animal. Like, I mean, people had a lot of time to process. They had a lot of time to compare that. Like how would that have felt for me? Like, what would I have done if that was my dog? What would I have done if that was my child? Okay. And so people were able to relate to it in a way that, you know, seeing a grainy, you know, photo from, you know, 150, 200 feet, you know, they actually watched that man's life seep from his body. And I think at that point, they were like, you know, there's no excuse for that. There is no way I could justify that. If that was an animal, if that was a child, if that was my husband, if that was my wife. And so it was a transformative moment here. And I've actually been down to some of the protests. I have teenage daughters that, you know, insisted I go and understand really what was going on there. And it was just incredible to be in the midst of that energy, in the midst of that positiveness, and to see, you know, young white kids, Asian kids, you know, saying the end of racism, the end of Black Lives Matter. I mean, that is just an incredible transformative moment. And I've likened it, you know, in a number of conversations that I've had to being our Berlin Wall moment, that brick by brick, the symbols, the practices, the policies of racial oppression are being attacked. And whether you're talking about the removal of Confederate statues, or whether you're seeing the names of Confederate soldiers come off of our army depots and installations around this country, you're seeing major financial institutions, you know, making hundreds of millions of dollars available to make up for redlining that is, you know, continued up until this day. So there's a lot of promise in this movement. And I remember when there was the Parkland shooting in 2018, and those kids just said, look, this is never going to happen again. We're not going to tolerate this. There's not another group of kids that should be afraid to go to school. And if you, America, are scared of the NRA, we're not. And we're not going to stop until we can get the gun problem in this country under control. And things really haven't been the same since. And what happened in Minneapolis, I think, was just the tipping point that gave extra fuel to the movement. It's been a very positive thing.
I want to sort of double down on what Roger was talking about in terms of the substantive sort of difference or change is really due to the pandemic. And I think it's because of what he was talking about in terms of the very structures of our lives have changed. So whether people are, you know, getting let go from their positions, whether they're being asked to work from home, or our children are being asked to learn remotely, we suddenly, you know, have much more time to actually think through and to grapple with the weight of what has happened in many countries or many cities across the country. And so because there's no escape, because there's no, you know, once you've watched your last Netflix marathon or whatever you're doing during quarantine, even that gets old for a while. And so we're forced to really deal with and to grapple with the immense violence that is being visited upon Black bodies in particular. I think the other part of what's going on is also there's a, you know, a pseudo legal term called the weight of history, meaning that you know, because history has progressed as it is, even if injustice has been done, you just kind of have to keep rolling with it. And I think what many communities of color and poor communities are facing right now is that not only are we having to grapple with the realities of the violence, but we're also having to grapple with a recognition of that weight of history that has been perpetrated in certain cases upon us. And so when you're grappling with current trauma and past trauma, you do get to that point where it's the straw that sort of breaks the camel's back.
Okay, the next question I have is, how do the present events and social responses tie to past events for the country and various communities? How does the past influence the present experience, for example, with issues of trauma or unresolved trauma?
Mm-hmm. I think if you just go back to that list that Roger, you know, provided us in terms of, you know, being able to trace that history of violence against the Black body, right? Whether we're talking about the slave, you know, entire structure of slavery, whether we're talking about Jim Crow laws, whether we're talking about Emmett Till, whether we're talking about Michael Brown. I mean, there's just such a clear line, right? From these past ways of commodifying and attempting to sell Black bodies, right? And this notion today that Black bodies are expendable. And when you see that just sort of very clear thread throughout US history, you know, it becomes this moment of, you know, especially the younger generation, I think, saying enough is enough. We can't exist within such a, you know, exploitative structure anymore. I think, you know, the same thing is true within Indigenous communities that has sort of risen up as a result of COVID, and people are actively going back to narratives of surviving smallpox epidemics or cholera epidemics, even the 1918 flu epidemic. These are remembered in Indigenous communities because there's such a premium on remembering you know, our ancestors and relatives who have passed away before us and what they've gone through. And as much as we, you know, are drawing from and recognizing maybe the trauma that our communities have experienced, we're also recognizing that we are descendants of the freedom fighters and the survivors and the people who were really successful at building a life and trying to rebuild, you know, our communities in the face of, you know, massive violence against Native people. I'm sure the same is true within the African American community and within Latinx communities. We know how to deal with this in certain ways. So it's not all, I think, a sort of negative response to trauma as much as it's a recognition that this is going to require us to once again have to dig deep and withstand some of these things that are happening.
You know, Angela, as you're talking, I think back to, again, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and how at a certain point, the young people seemed to have this welling up of frustration because they felt not enough was being done, not enough real substantive change had taken place. Certainly, you know, we saw the Civil Rights Act of 64, and then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which incidentally was part of one of the amendments. But then those rights got withdrawn. And so even though the rights were granted, they were swiftly snatched away. It was like, psych, you don't have it. Thought you did, but you don't. So I think what we're seeing again is a kind of a reckoning, because the young people are at the forefront of the current civil rights movement. We're calling it the Black Lives Matter movement. But it is that same level of frustration, even that Greg brought up, that they felt enough is enough. Folks have had enough. And what I think is so wonderful about this moment is that we're starting, even immediately, we're starting to see substantive changes where there, even though it's not across the board, but in various pockets across the country, we're seeing police reforms already, where that no-knock order in Louisville was, look, no more. And just recently, we saw, even though the police officers responsible for the death of Breonna Taylor have not been brought to criminal justice, but the police department has, or the city has paid out $12 million, as I understand it, the highest payout that we've seen for that kind of action. So we're seeing little moments of change. And for me, I find that very inspiring. It's a different moment. It's connected, and we've seen these things before. But again, I have to say, there's something different about this moment in time. There's something different. And I'm very hopeful that we will see more of this kind of substantive change, police reform, more resources for underserved and marginalized communities, and more than just simply social justice and civil rights for the Black community. We're going to start to see, and I think we're also seeing more attention given to other ethnic communities. Native communities have started, to talk more about this, and they're getting more attention. Latinx communities are seeing more attention to issues that they're having. Women's issues are starting to get more attention, even right now, as we see in the Democratic ticket, the first African-American woman who is occupying many spaces, but she is now running as the vice presidential candidate. So we're starting to see in this moment more really observable, actionable, substantive change. And I think there is hope to be had in that.
Yeah, just one last thing I would add is I'm just so impressed with the young people in this country. It reminds me a little bit of the anti-war movement, which I was a little bit too young to participate in, but I've just been so impressed and so proud to see not just the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement on here, as Roger was saying and as Angela was saying, everything is being challenged, everything is open for question. And, looking at, whether or not people who have served their time in prison should be stripped of their right to vote. Like, really, what is the justification for that? So questioning everything, the difficulty that people have in this country to vote. Like, why isn't Election Day a holiday so that you can go vote? Why are the polls closing at precisely the time that people generally get off work? Like, everything is being questioned, and it's sort of being in the vanguard of that is this new generation of woke young people that we've raised over the last 15 to 20 years to sort of question things, to sort of look at things from a multicultural perspective, and that's why I'm so encouraged about this movement. And our universities and colleges across this country really need to really lean into this and to keep that momentum going for open-mindedness and really understanding that as part of the civic duty to question why things are the way they are and figure out how they can be different.
Can I just add to that, what you just said, Greg, as we're looking at various areas and even across the board, the country, our educational institutions, particularly in higher ed, are looking at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it's not just higher ed. In my own particular field of music, I'm very excited that, as you say, various areas are being and facing these challenges. In the classical music arena, it is so encouraging to see how these spaces and these places where Black folks have been relegated to the margins and where doors have been closed, now we're seeing the same things that you were just talking about. People are being questioned, these kinds of policies. Why aren't there more Black conductors? Why aren't there more opportunities for male and female Black opera singers? Why aren't there more people playing in that orchestra? You know, these are the conversations, like you said, everything now is being challenged. It's not just one area and it's not just one ethnic group. All issues of social justice are being challenged. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
I agree.
Great, thank you. There we have we're getting some questions from the audience and I want to move to some of those. One, I think, builds on what you're talking about, various successes that have happened and also how this is more than single issue, but more of a movement. And one of our audience members asked, what does a fully realized social justice movement look like? That is, what will we look like as a community and as a nation when our work is done? What will be the biggest shifts in our perspectives and major institutions?
Well, you know, I think it's impossible to say, you know, when the work is going to be finished. I think it's a work in progress. It's never going to be finished. But I think one of the things that's going to happen is like the names of slave owners are going to go off the names of buildings at Yale and Harvard and other, you know, sort of paragons of higher education, that, you know, the names of traitors to this country who tried to, you know, take down the Union are not going to have federal military installations named after them. What kind of sense does that make? It actually doesn't make any sense. You know, like my grandkids, fortunately, are not going to have to walk through the grocery stores and look at Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben anymore on the foodstuffs that we buy. Like, why did that exist for all these years, okay? Like, I didn't even buy cream of wheat. I refused to buy cream of wheat or Aunt Jemima pancake mix for my young daughters to grow up seeing. Like, why did we have to do that? And so, you know, what is it going to look like? Well, it's not going to look like it's been looking for the last 10 to 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's progress, right? I think, you know, the curriculums at some of our institutions of higher learning are going to be more inclusive. Like, you know, they're not going to be overt symbols that says Black stuff doesn't matter. Like, you know, you have African-American history, but you don't offer a major in it. You have women's studies, but you don't offer a major in that. Those kinds of things are going to be questioned. They're going to be changed. Hopefully our educational process will be a little bit more interdisciplinary than it's been. There'll be more people of color teaching courses. There'll be more contemporary books that are considered classics so that we don't have to keep reading David Copperfield for the next 50 years as if nothing else matters. I mean, opening up the process to other ways of thinking and including other ways of learning and including other kinds of scholarship is a progression. But if you can open the gate, if you can open the roads so that other voices can be heard, other stories can be told, that's going to be just huge, huge, huge progress. So I think the way we know that we're making progress is when other perspectives are getting the kind of weight that you know, previous perspectives, you know, seem to have a toehold on the way things were taught, the way things are valued, the way we learn and what we learn.
I just wanted to add too that we have this sort of popularized perception of what a social justice movement is and how it's sustained and what it looks like. And people tend to think of social justice movements as protest in the streets. But if you look at all of these movements, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter, these are movements that are almost entirely sustained on community members who are deeply engaged in fighting things like police brutality or fighting for civil rights. And oftentimes there's a huge amount of hidden work that has been done within communities where you'll have, several people who are consistently organizing, and they're not doing it as part of, I am president of the NAACP. They're doing it as church members. They're doing it in community centers. There's not really like a discrete difference between their organizing work and just who they are as community members and how they see their responsibilities as just human beings, right? I think two of the activists I respect most in my own community are two sisters who live way out in the country in the middle of nowhere, but they are always holding our tribal council to account. They are going to meetings. They are publicizing things on Facebook. They're not president of anything, right? They're not out in the streets protesting, but they're doing the sort of finicky daily work that it requires to keep people educated and engaged. And my gut instinct when I look at Black Lives Matter is that the protests that we're seeing, that's the tip of the iceberg. But the rest of the iceberg is the work community members have done to keep this issue alive, regardless of, wide public disinterest for decades, right? In really questioning, why are we talking about law and order? Why is Dukakis's election suddenly sunk because Bush brings up Willie Horton, right? And so when we think about a fully realized social justice movement, I would just say that, and I'm sorry, my son is exercising in the background, he's 8. So when we think about these social justice movements, there's almost the more important work, which are these community members who have kept the flame alive, right? And they're protecting it. And only because they've kept that flame alive is it able to sort of erupt, right, in these moments of possibility.
I also think that we'll see, and I don't know that the work will ever be completely done, but one sign might be that we don't need to have a Black History Month course, because American history will involve a total and a complete history that reflects all of our American peoples. Another thing I think that will be a sign that we're making our way towards that is when we begin to tackle the difficult question, when we start to, or questions, when we have the difficult conversations. We've never really had the conversation about race because it's been too uncomfortable for many people in our country. And I think when we can finally do the hard work, have the hard conversations, and when we can delve into the very fabric of our society and dismantle what is systemic racism, what is institutionalized racism, when we can have those conversations, when we don't have to, when we look at the television screen and when we look at the movie screen and we see all of our society represented, and we don't have to say, well, we need to have a Black show, we need to have an Asian show. When Friends is up there and it looks like all of us, and you're now asking the question, well, where are the Black friends? Did they not have any Black friends? When we can have those conversations and say those things, when there's no longer a need to say those things, that's when we can say we have arrived. But I think it's going to be a while. What I want to see first is, let's see the progress. Let's start doing the hard work. And that's going to take time. And at the beginning, it's going to be hurtful. It's like when you have a cancer, first there must be surgery, but first you got to recognize that there's an issue that requires surgery. And then there's pain after that. There's recovery, right? There's reconstruction and rehabilitation that needs to happen, which means we have to be willing to go and take the via dolorosa, go the way of pain. Let's have the difficult conversation. Let's be willing to do the rough work, realizing that when we get to the other side of that, there is joy, and from a theological perspective. But we must understand we have to go through that first. And until we are, you still got that festering sore underneath the Band-Aid.
Wow, that's great. Oh, Angela.
What gets measured gets addressed, right? And if you think about when we're able to look at disparities in the preparation of kindergartners, or if we're able to look at, I think about Ida B. Wells, right? And just like this groundbreaking work that she did in documenting lynching in the United States, and many Black intellectuals of the early 20th century, right? Doing this work of just tallying up the violence, right? These are documents that not only impacted policy in their own time, but these are documents that we now look back upon today to be able to understand this history and legacy of violence. So I think part of, what I was thinking of as Roger was talking is that we continue to keep track and we continue to measure our progress, right? And we continue to have these difficult conversations. And when we see wide disparities by race, by class, by gender, whatever it may be, when we, home language, right? When we see any of those disparities, it's only then that we're able to, accurately and to begin to address them. So I think that's also part of what policymakers need to continue to invest in at this juncture, right? Because there's the in the streets activism, and then there's the activism that has to happen within our structures and our institutions.
That's great, and I think that leads to one of the other audience members' questions in thinking through how to do that in terms of there's a vision where we're going, the necessity of making progress and measuring. One of our audience members says, I agree that institutions of higher learning need to lean into this moment and this movement. And I think this comment can be brought in for other institutions, societal institutions too. But these same institutions are also grappling with funding and attendance issues. Do you think that we have the bandwidth to tackle all the social issues that are presenting, or should we be prioritizing somehow? And I don't know how to do that, the audience member says, but it seems like we're rightly turning over a lot of rocks at the same time. So sort of the response of how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to turn over all the rocks you can so you can figure out what the scope of the problem is. That just has to happen. It can be expensive, it can be confusing, or what have you. But I think only by sort of seeing the landscape can you figure out what the priorities should be. And you know what, we find money for all kinds of things. Like I personally don't want to hear any excuses about sort of, addressing problems as systematic and as important as equality, right? And treating people equally and giving people the full opportunity to reach their potential. There's no price that can be put on it. This is America. This is what America is. And so, is it costly? Yeah. Have we wasted a lot of money on a bunch of things? Yeah. I think we can be smarter about how we spend money and what our priorities are. But what normally happens is dealing with issues of equity and race and gender always get pushed to the side during tough times, which is why one of the reasons why we can never make any progress. And what I think this coalition of people are saying in this movement is that the time for patience and the time for let's push this off until times get better, that's over with. That's not how we're going to approach solving problems anymore. And I think that's a new generational lens on how we conduct business in this country, okay? Like I think my generation and the generation before the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King and all those people and the people that marched with them, they did great work, right? But they were only able to get the ball to, the 20-yard line. Well, this next generation, they're gonna score it and walk through the end zone and, that's it. I mean, they're not playing around here. And anything that I can do and people of my generation can do to support that, to sort of help them understand how you wield the levers of power better. Anything we can do to help, that's great. But we let them lead, and the way they want to lead is, this is no more postponement. Let's turn over all the rocks we can. Let's see what the scope of the problem is. Then we'll identify what our priorities are. Like there is, for example, no reason why women continue to make 79 cents on the dollar to a man. I mean, come on, really? I mean, there's just no excuse for that. And so turning that rock over and saying, you know what, yeah, that has that has an equal priority with, dealing with, police issues too, and communities of color. Like that shouldn't be like number 12. We think that should be number 2, what have you. But I think, looking at the situation and then figuring out, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the medium challenge? What are the things that are going to take legislation in maybe a year or 2 or 3 to get done? That's fair, but I don't think things are going to be put off because of money or because they're difficult.
You know what comes to mind for me, especially after what you just said, Greg? There's a thing called a soccer mom. And these mothers who have children and are raising families know how to multitask. They know how to get this person over to that place, this person over to that place, get the homework done, keep the house clean, get the laundry done, get dinner on the table, and keep a full-time job. So I say, get more women in charge.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I do not disagree with that at all.
I'm also thinking there's a cost, right, to not trying to address things in a more holistic way.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at a structure of power, right, and we can call this structure white supremacy. White supremacy isn't only built on the extraction of labor and commodification of Black bodies, right? It's also built on appropriating indigenous lands. It's also built upon defining certain people as, eternal outsiders. So like immigrants, right? When we're thinking about how historically Asian Americans, Latinx immigrants have been always defined as something that is outside of who we consider to be American, right? These are these pillars that support a power structure that is negatively impacting multiple communities, including the white community, right? Because there is a cost to maintaining these extractive type of power structures. So when we think about, on a college campus, right, with limited resources, how are we possibly going to deal with all of this? Well, some of these negative power structures that none of us want to perpetuate, none of us want, a sort of extractive, exploitative power structure with our fellow human beings.
Right.
If we want to actually address that, we're going to have that wide bandwidth, right? And we're going to have to commit to it and recognize we're not going to do it perfectly, but if we don't start, we're never going to make progress.
Right.
So it may feel confusing. We may want to think, oh, I want to address X, Y, or Z issue, and let's go ahead and forget about gender, or let's go ahead and, sort of marginalize the Latinx student experience or what have you, right? But the reality is you have to have the ability to hold multiple issues and multiple problems in your head at one point in
Right.
order to make sure that all boats can rise.
Great, thank you. That's really thoughtful about how turning over all rocks and taking action. One of the audience members is energized by your optimism, especially in the context of a very grim year. His question goes to something that I think reflects what Greg talked about, and that is there are people with experience who have been trying to make a difference, as Angela pointed out, in many different ways over time. And the questioner has the recognition that, as Roger pointed out earlier, there's reaction to progress. So the question is, my question goes in a more pessimistic or worried direction. Namely, what obstacles and traps do you see in the movement, the efforts ahead? How, in particular, do we overcome the reactionary forces that seem equally energized right now?
Well, the way you counter fear is with facts, right? Even though we've become a factless society and, truth has become a casualty, you sort of count. Look, here's the thing. the big fear out there is the browning of America. Like most people don't want to talk about it or whatever, but that's really what it is. And what comes with that fear is sort of, you know, losing our language, English, you know, losing, you know, certain privileges that people have had, worried about retribution. We got to have a discussion about what this country is going to be like. Okay, when, you know, an increasing number of folks here are going to be speaking Spanish, and they're going to be speaking Chinese, and we're going to become more multicultural and more global, right? Like, what is that going to mean? What does it mean to be an American? We need to be talking about those things instead of like huddled in our silos, you know, worried about, you know, whether or not, you know, certain groups, when they get power, whether they're going to do this, that, and the other, you know, are they going to be seeking retribution? I mean, those are the kinds of things that create fear. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about how laws are going to change. What does anti-discrimination laws mean in a multicultural society, right? We need to talk about those things, but since we won't talk about those things, you know, people are just hunkered down trying to protect what they know about. And so I think what we're going to have to do is sort of come to grips, talk honestly about what's happening in this country, why it's happening, that, you know, there are certain things that are quintessential about what it means to be an American. And a lot of it has to do with our Constitution, of course. But that, yeah, you know, while the complexion of this country may change, there's certain values. And if we're not fighting about that, but we're actually sort of figuring out how do we build on that and make sure that we have a mutual understanding of what those values are and that they're going to be respected, okay? Then yeah, we're going to be susceptible to fear mongering and lies and, you know, the destruction of our institutions in order to protect, you know, self-interested, you know, special interest groups in this country. But I see a way forward. Like Roger was saying, it's going to be painful. It's like, you know, going through a medical procedure, and you know, you got to go through a recovery period and a convalescence period, and you need some help, you know, to walk and get back on your feet. That's where we are as a country. I mean, we're crippled right now, but to get back on our feet, you know, we're going to have to take a more clinical medical approach to this problem. Diagnose it, treat it, you know, have a recovery, and then, you know, hopefully get back to a healthy place. That's the process. You know, there's 7 stages of grief. Well, there are like 4 or 5 stages of sort of recovering from disease. And racism is a disease.
I think also building community, and we see the beginnings of that in the protests with people from various walks of life coming together and working together. If we can stop, as has already been said, get rid of this notion of the silo and hunkering down, as Greg just said, and trying to protect what's mine. But this whole notion, as we here at DU have begun our first week of classes, we're now midway, well, towards the end of, it's Friday tomorrow, wow. But to just think about, one of the things, I brought that up because I'm teaching a course on the spirituals and the blues, and to help my students understand how African American music has been structured, how it came together, what are the components. I start with them on a discussion on African culture. And my point with that is one of the key components to African culture is the importance of community. The idea that every individual is important in community. Ubuntu, that I am because we are. And we see, not necessarily from a clear African perspective, but we see elements of what that means. When an old person is being helped by a young person, as people are being forced to self-quarantine, and people come and bring food to them. They check in on their neighbor to see how they're doing. How someone that was white got shot, and then a black man helps in England. We saw the picture of that, pick them up and carry them. We see people coming together. We need to nurture these elements of community, of the coming together, and hold our officials, our leadership accountable. And that let them know, and it's so important, this vote that's coming up in November, that is where we make our voice heard. So community coming together, and as Greg said, we can't be paralyzed by fear. Fear will paralyze us and not allow us to go forward. And we cannot afford to become overwhelmed with pessimism. We need to nurture these elements of greatness that we see, these elements of hope. Those are the things we need to nurture, and they're there. We see them. We've seen them in Denver, how people have come together, how they're patronizing businesses. Just on the news today, I saw someone that gave their car to a waitress. So those are the things we need to continue to nurture. They're already there. Do not allow ourselves to become overcome by doom and gloom.
Mhm.
I think, like, as a historian, it's very easy to be pessimistic because you have to grapple sort of daily with a lot of past violence and just sort of the horrors that have happened in the past. But there's a really great African-American historian named Robin D.G. Kelly. And when he writes about like the African-American community in the South, he looks at community practices that are self-supporting, such as the ones that Roger was referring to, in terms of even in the face of just overwhelming violence, right? Being able to come together and to support each other, not just materially, but emotionally, right? And spiritually. And he makes the assertion that at the bottom of any social movement, love and freedom are the foundations of it, right? So that's something that I try to remember when I get pessimistic. The other thing that I would say is that at the college that I went to when I was an undergrad, we had this huge mural on our wall, and it was in the Chicano themed dorm, what was called the Chicano themed dorm. At that, now it would probably be the Chicanx themed dorm, right? And so it was like this representation of the last summer, and there was a quote underneath it, and it said, this is for everybody who fought, died, cried, and scrubbed floors for us, right? And that is a huge gamut of possible ways of resistance and creating community that recognizes that even though, your grandma might not be out in the streets, if she's out there scrubbing floors for you, right, to help fund your college education or to give you a better life than she had, that's a really powerful, optimistic act. And these people are all around us, right? So I think it's easy to get pessimistic, but let's remember that there are many people who love us and who love each other, right, in the world, and they're out there every day working and scrubbing floors for us, just like the people who are out in the streets fighting for us.
I'm going to ask one more question, but before I ask that, and it'll be a quick question, is I just want to let everyone know that you'll be getting information and a link to the recording of this in your email. We'll send you information about further talks and webinars in the series, including our Livingston lecture, which is coming up in October. And I really hope you'll continue to be a part of this conversation, which is exactly what our panelists have said we need to keep doing, is be a part of this conversation. My last question to each of the panelists. Everyone is here because they care and want to learn and figure out how to act. What do you recommend? What are some options for those who are here to leave and start doing? What can they do to move things forward after they leave this panel discussion?
I would say, I think a goal should be that everybody should be trying to make themselves more comfortable talking about these difficult issues. And one of the ways you become more comfortable is you become more secure in your knowledge about what you're talking about. And so I think people need to just almost like you would do a Bible study where you say, like, in a year, I'm going to read the Bible. Like, take a year and read about the Latino culture. And the issues and some of the literature, and include in that year some history about Native Americans, like really what happened, and there are a lot of great books out there. There are a lot of great books about what has happened over the course of this country's history from 1619 to now, about sort of the pain and there are reasons. There's actual great scholarship out there about the wealth gap between people of color and white people in this country and why it exists. Okay, take a year and just really spend time learning about what the future of this country is going to be like, because you can't wish it away. You can't close your eyes. You can't sit in the basement. You can't sit in a silo and hope and pray that this is not going to happen, that it's going to go away. It's not going to go away. But you know, if we care about America, we care about the country, and we care about other human beings, and I believe that we do. I mean, the thing we're seeing with the movement right now is it's all about, treating other humans with dignity and empathy and righting wrongs, right? Like historical wrongs. It's take a year, educate yourself so that you don't have to feel defensive when these issues come up, that, you can feel secure that you spent time trying to understand them so that you can truly open yourself up to learn. I think that would be a great personal commitment that would mean a lot as we move forward in this country.
There's an old African proverb. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so we have an elephant before us. It seems like you'll never get through it. And so it might be intimidating. It's like, but don't be afraid to start, because I guarantee you, I've seen it play out in my own life. Just start with one bite that leads to two, that leads to three, and then eventually full belly. But and then the other thing, kind of piggybacking on something that Greg just said, find yourselves in communities and friends that you perhaps have not had conversations with, and don't be afraid to make a mistake. You develop the thick skin and educate yourself, but don't be afraid to make a mistake. And if you do, just take that in, lots of listening, and then move forward. But don't allow your mistakes to paralyze you or to intimidate you or to move into a place of fear where you don't do anything. So start eating one bite at a time, educate yourselves, and then make some new friends.
I just want to double down on what Roger was saying in terms of being willing to make mistakes and just having that humility to approach and to be okay with the fact that we're all learners. I think professors tend to be very bad learners sometimes because we think we're experts. But there's definitely, this point where if you really want to have a real and authentic exchange of ideas, and humanity, right, with anyone, you're going to be able to recognize that there are some things that you're going to learn from this other person, whether it's, a 6-year-old or whether it's a 60-year-old, right? The other thing I would say is that we all just have to have more tough conversations because, things like sexism, binary gender systems, negative power dynamics are reinforced in all of our communities, right? I have had difficult conversations with some of my close family members about immigration because as Native people, they might be thinking, there's too many people coming to, our lands, right, from outside of the country. And, having those conversations about, well, wait a second, we actually benefit from U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism is what's driving much of this immigration. And, we have to take accountability for the fact within Indigenous communities of that we can't view immigrants in our country as sort of like the outside other that's kind of playing into like these power structures of white supremacy, right? And so every community has some blind areas where they could learn more. I think in particular, if you are a white American, it's time to talk to your family members, right? Because, when we look at election results, and we look at exit polls, right? Everybody, when 50%, right, or 53% of white women voted for Trump, every white person probably in this country has one family member who said, it doesn't matter, about this candidate's gender politics, I'm going to vote for him, right? And so maybe just start having those really uncomfortable conversations with our loved ones about areas that we don't know very much about and where we might see some areas that they could learn.
Thank you, Roger, Angela, Greg. This has been a feast of mouthfuls that are that have been really helpful and insightful, and I really appreciate your spending your time providing your expertise and sharing this with the wider community. To all of those in the wider community who spent an hour with us this afternoon, thank you for taking this time, and I hope you're all as inspired as I am to make progress and move towards the vision that was described by our panelists. Really appreciate it. Let's keep learning, let's keep acting, and let's keep working as a community. Have a nice evening and vote.